Welcome back. I'm going to show you how to make a portrait using only pieces of cutout paper, also called paper cut portraits, very cleverly titled. What you need for this is an image of a person, preferably, and you want to posterize it to 4 values. If you're not sure how to posterize, refer back to that video I posted recently about posterizing. Then you're going to print off, or I'm going to print for you, 4 copies of your posterized image. Then you want to take a pen or a pencil and label each one of your 4 values. So I'm writing 1s on all of the lightest values on Dolly's face here. I'm writing 2s in the second lightest value, 3s in the third lightest, and 4s in the darkest areas. So those are my 4 values that I'll be working with. After I've got all of those values identified, I'm going to want to decide which one there's the most of. Whichever value there is the most of is where I'm going to be starting my cuts. But first I want to choose 4 papers that match the 4 values that are in my photo. So I want to pick some colors of construction paper. Usually you want to pick different values of the same color. So I'm using blue for my portrait, and I'm choosing a light, a medium, medium dark, and a dark. So if you're not sure if your papers are showing correct values, you can take a picture of them and turn it black and white like I've done here. And if you turn your image black and white and you can recognize 4 different values, then your papers will work for this project. They're showing 4 different values. So now earlier when I said that you want to start with the paper that there is the most of value-wise, what I mean is you want to pick the value that appears the most in your work, and that's where you want to start. So for mine, I have mostly 2s in my portrait here. So my first step is I'm going to cut out the outline of my portrait. This is one of my 4 copies. You're going to be kind of cutting through each one of your copies. So I'm going to cut out the whole outline of her figure. While you're cutting, you may come to some areas where it's kind of difficult to tell where one part stops and another part begins. So this is where it might be helpful to have the original unposterized photo to refer back to, so that while you're cutting you have it as a reference and you can kind of check back and forth and make sure that you're getting all the parts that you need. So now that I've got her cut all the way, and then cut it out, of course. Make sure that you go slow, take your time. This is not an activity or a project where you can rush through it. You want to make sure that you're cutting the parts that you mean to be cutting, make sure that you're focusing, make sure that you're not distracted. This is a good time to put some earbuds in your ears and listen to some music and just get into the flow. So once I've got the shape of the value that is used the most, what I'm going to do next is decide where I want to start, and I'm going to cut out 1 value at a time. So I've already got all of my number 2 values cut out. That's my sort of background that I'll be gluing onto. So I'm starting with 1s. If I'm looking at the lightest areas of her face, those are the areas that I'm going to start cutting first. So treating those spots just like a shape, I've got them labeled, and I'm using my X-Acto knife to cut out the shape. So I've got that construction paper underneath one of my copies, and I'm using the X-Acto knife to cut through the photocopy through the construction paper in the bottom to get out that shape. Make sure that you go slow. Make sure that you're showing basic safety, precautions with your X-Acto knife. Don't cut towards yourself, cut away from yourself. Make sure that you're using a sharp blade. Make sure that you don't point at anybody. Make sure that when you're not using it, that the safety cap is on it and it's sitting on your table. Make sure that you're rotating your portrait around to make it a little bit easier to cut out some of those shapes for you. So now you can see I'm doing a little check here to make sure that it's going through. You may want to put a little piece of masking tape somewhere onto your paper to secure it while you're cutting so it doesn't wiggle around and you don't lose the spot of where you were at. That can be a frustrating thing to get lined back up. You're gonna keep cutting out all of your shapes in pretty much this way, starting one value at a time. I try to get out all of the biggest chunks of each value, and then I can go back with any scrap paper that I have and I can fill in any smaller details. So I'm focusing on the big areas, trying to get as much of those number one values as I can. So now once I've cut that shape all the way out, you may need to use your X-Acto knife to cut through any little pieces where it's still hung up. Unfortunately, I didn't record this part, but I'll show you again. You're going to use that top copy that you've been cutting from and use that as a guide for where to glue it onto your background paper. So that's what I did for placing those number one values on her face. That's what I'm going to do here for placing those number one values in her eye, on her hair, some of those little tiny pieces that I'm cutting out now. So I'm going to take that template. The areas where I've cut out those pieces will show me where to place the pieces that I've just cut out. So you want to go slow, you want to take your time, you want to make sure you're doing nice clean cuts. It will make it a lot easier to remove those papers and place them where they need to go. So now I can keep going, continuing cutting those number ones, repeating that process of cutting out the shape of a value, using the template that I'm cutting from, placing it on top of my image and using it as a template, using it as a guide for where to glue my pieces. So everything should line right back up as long as I'm doing cuts correctly and as long as I'm cutting out those shapes appropriately. So you want to use a glue stick, put the glue on the back side, use the template to guide where it goes, and make sure that you press in and make sure that it's really nice and stuck. You want to make sure that you're using enough glue, but not too much glue. The glue sticks usually dry clear, so you don't have to worry too much about that, but sometimes they can leave a residue on your fingers, and the more that you're working, the gluier they get and can attach to your paper, make it look kind of dirty. So it's a good idea to stop and wash your hands every once in a while too. Make sure that you're not getting any residue on your pieces. And so now I'm continuing the process of cutting out those number ones, using the paper copy as a template, as a guide to show me where to place each one of those pieces. And you're going to repeat that process for all the values in your portrait. Remember that you should have at least 4. So after I've got all of my number ones, I'm going to move on. My number 2 value is my background, so my next step is going to be working on my number 3 value. It's my third darkest paper. That's some of these shadows on her face. So just like I did before, I'm placing my paper underneath one of my fresh copies, and I'm cutting through the top layer, the top copy, and placing it, using that top copy as a guide to place that piece. This project takes some time. Don't try to rush through it. You will be much more pleased with your final product if you take your time, make sure you're doing clean cuts, make sure that you're using glue appropriately so it's not getting stuck everywhere, not getting residue on your pieces you're not meaning to get it on. Keep your work clean. Show good craftsmanship. Show pride in your work. This is not a race. This video is condensing probably about 9 hours of work into about 15 minutes. So don't let a time-lapsed video fool you. This project takes time. But the results are pretty interesting when you're done. They look pretty impressive. Looks like it looks almost like a digital portrait, like you were working in graphic design, but it's paper. Okay, so now I'm working on my final value. I'm finally working on that number 4 value. That's my black paper. It's my darkest area. It's the least amount of spaces that I'm working with. I've got her eyelashes, got the pupils of her eye. There's some spaces in her hair. Looks like maybe a headband or some sort of hair accessory that she's wearing. Better that number 5 value. Some areas in her shirt. So I'm going to focus on all of those teeny tiny little number 5 areas. I'm going to cut out a piece at a time, and I'm going to use that copy as a guide. You may want to make sure that you have other copies on hand. Sometimes there will be a copy where it's a little bit easier to place your values in. So work with what you've got. Make sure that you're referring back to the original image also. It is helpful to see some of those details put back into a realistic photo rather than posterized, just to compare and contrast and make sure that everything is looking the way that it's supposed to. So now it's the final stretch here. I'm getting some of those final number 4 darkest value areas cut out from my paper. And once I've got all of those values added, my portrait is complete. Then I'm going to pick a new background paper to glue it down to. I'm going to take that whole portrait. I want to pick a color that pops, something contrasting, something that maybe represents my person in some way. Make sure that you use plenty of glue, still using glue sticks. Apply it to the back side. Put it glue side down onto your color paper. And then flip it over and burnish onto the back side so you don't rip up any pieces. And you've completed your portrait. Congratulations.